The German officer's hands trembled as he lowered his binoculars. Through the swirling snow and morning fog of December 22nd, 1944, he had just witnessed something that defied all military logic. His Panzer Division, equipped with the most advanced tanks in the Wehrmacht arsenal, had been forced to retreat. Not by superior firepower, not by overwhelming numbers, but by American paratroopers who should have surrendered days ago. "They have no winter clothing," the officer muttered to his commander. "No artillery support. They are surrounded. They should be begging for mercy." He paused, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "But sir, they're coming toward us. In the snow, with nothing but rifles and rage in their eyes." The commander's face went pale. He had heard the stories whispered among the ranks. Stories about the American soldiers with the screaming eagle patches on their shoulders. The 101st Airborne Division. Men who jumped from the sky on D-Day and fought through hell itself. But he had dismissed them as mere propaganda, designed to boost Allied morale. Now, watching his battle-hardened veterans retreat from the Belgian town of Bastogne, he understood the terrible truth. These Americans weren't just soldiers. They were something else entirely. One of his sergeants burst into the command post, snow covering his uniform, his eyes wide with something the commander had never seen in a German soldier's face before. Pure, unfiltered fear. "Sir, they've captured 3 of our tanks. 3. And they're using them against us now. The men are saying these Americans are devils. They fight in conditions that would kill normal men. They won't surrender. They won't retreat. And sir, the worst part." The sergeant's voice cracked. "They're laughing. In the middle of battle, surrounded by our forces, freezing to death, and they're laughing at us." The commander grabbed a decoded message that had just arrived. It was the response the American commander had given when the Germans demanded his surrender. One word. Just one word that would echo through military history and strike terror into the hearts of every German soldier who heard it. Nuts. What kind of men respond to a surrender demand with mockery? What kind of soldiers, outnumbered 5-1, surrounded, low on ammunition, freezing in the worst winter in decades, tell the mighty German army to go to hell? The commander looked out at the frozen landscape of Bastogne, where his forces had the Americans completely encircled. Every tactical advantage belonged to Germany. Every military manual said the Americans should be defeated within hours. But something had gone catastrophically wrong. And as artillery shells began raining down on his position from those supposedly defenseless Americans, as reports flooded in of his men abandoning their posts rather than face the screaming eagles again, the commander realized a horrifying truth. The hunters had become the hunted. And the eagles were screaming for blood. Before we dive deeper into this incredible true story, if you're captivated by untold stories of courage and impossible odds, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another tale of extraordinary bravery. Trust me, you'll want to be here for what comes next. Now, let's discover how these American paratroopers became the soldiers that even the German army learned to fear. To understand why battle-hardened German soldiers would flee in terror from American paratroopers, we need to rewind to June 6, 1944. D-Day. The day the 101st Airborne Division earned their fearsome reputation by doing something most military commanders considered suicidal. Private James Miller from Oklahoma was 21 years old when he jumped out of a C-47 transport plane into the darkness over Nazi-occupied France. He was terrified. They all were. The plane shook violently as German anti-aircraft fire tore through the night sky. Men around him prayed. Some cried. Others just stared straight ahead, gripping their rifles so hard their knuckles turned white. 30 seconds. The jumpmaster yelled over the roar of engines and exploding shells. James looked at his best friend, Bobby Chin from San Francisco, sitting across from him. Bobby gave him a weak smile and a thumbs up. They had trained together for 2 years, jumped out of planes dozens of times in training. But this was different. This time, people below were actively trying to kill them. The green light flashed. Go, go, go. James threw himself into the black void. The shock of the parachute opening knocked the wind from his lungs. Below him, tracers lit up the sky like deadly fireflies. Explosions bloomed orange and red across the French countryside. He could see other paratroopers descending around him, silhouettes against the flames. Some of those parachutes weren't opening. Some were on fire. He hit the ground hard, rolling through a hedgerow. Pain shot through his ankle. Gunfire erupted somewhere to his left. German voices shouted in the darkness. James fumbled with his cricket clicker, the small metal device they used to identify friendlies in the dark. Click-clack. Click-clack. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the hedgerow, an answering click-clack. Click-clack. "That you, Miller?" It was Sergeant Davis from Chicago, emerging from the shadows with his Thompson submachine gun. "Yeah, Sarge. You seen Bobby?" Davis's expression said everything. "Kid, half our stick is scattered across 5 miles of France. We've got maybe 15 guys from a company that's supposed to be 200 strong. No radios. No heavy weapons. And the Germans know we're here." For the next 36 hours, James and his scattered group of paratroopers fought a desperate guerrilla war behind enemy lines. They ambushed German patrols, destroyed communications equipment, captured crossroads that military planners said were impossible to take. They were cold, hungry, exhausted, and completely surrounded. And they refused to quit. By the end of the first week, something remarkable had happened. The scattered groups had found each other. The 101st Airborne had accomplished every single one of their D-Day objectives, despite being dropped miles from their intended landing zones. German prisoners who were captured kept asking the same question in broken English. "Where are the rest of your men? How many divisions landed?" They couldn't believe that these soldiers who fought with such ferocity, such determination, were just one division of paratroopers. James Miller survived D-Day. He fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a battlefield and every farmhouse could hide a German machine gun nest. He helped liberate French villages where people wept with joy and threw flowers at the American soldiers. He watched friends die. He saved lives. He became harder, tougher, more resilient than he ever thought possible. By December 1944, James and the 101st Airborne had been through hell and back. They had earned a rest. They had earned a break from the fighting. The Allied command had promised them time to recover, to heal, to become human again. But war doesn't care about promises. And in December 1944, Hitler launched one final desperate gamble that would thrust the Screaming Eagles into their greatest test yet. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the 101st Airborne was about to write their names in history with blood, courage, and one defiant word that would echo through the ages. The trucks arrived at Camp Mormelon, France on December 17, 1944, interrupting what should have been a well-deserved rest. James Miller was playing cards with Bobby Chen and a few other guys from Easy Company when Lieutenant Winters burst into the barracks. "Grab your gear. Everything you can carry. We roll out in 1 hour." "Where we going, sir?" Bobby asked, gathering up the cards. "Belgium. Place called Bastogne. Germans have broken through our lines. It's bad, boys. Real bad." James looked down at his boots. They were worn through. Half the men didn't have proper winter gear. They'd turned in their cold weather equipment, expecting to spend Christmas in France. Now they were being rushed into Belgium in the middle of winter with whatever they could scrounge together. The convoy moved through the night. James sat in the back of a freezing truck, wrapped in a thin blanket, watching snow begin to fall. Around him, men tried to sleep, but the tension was thick. They could hear distant artillery fire growing louder with each passing mile. The German offensive was massive, pushing American forces back in the largest retreat since the beginning of the war. "You scared?" Bobby whispered. James thought about lying, but what was the point? "Yeah. You." Terrified. "But hey, we jumped into France in the dark with the whole German army shooting at us. We can handle some snow, right?" They arrived in Bastogne on December 19th. The town was chaos. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing the German advance. American units were retreating through the streets, exhausted, defeated, their eyes hollow. Some of the men barely had weapons. Officers yelled conflicting orders. Nobody seemed to know what was happening. Colonel Sink gathered the 101st Airborne in the town square. Snow fell on their helmets as he addressed them. "Gentlemen, we are surrounded. The Germans have us cut off from all sides. We have limited ammunition, limited food, and winter is just getting started. Our orders are simple. Hold Bastogne. No matter what." A private from another company raised his hand. "Sir, when's the relief coming?" Sink's expression was grim. "I don't know, son. Could be days. Could be weeks. But until they get here, we hold this town. Because if Bastogne falls, the Germans push through to Antwerp. If they reach Antwerp, they cut off all Allied supplies. And if that happens, we could lose this war." The weight of those words settled over the paratroopers like the falling snow. Everything depended on them. Not a massive army. Not divisions of tanks. Just them. The screaming eagles. Within hours, they began transforming Bastogne into a fortress. They dug foxholes in the frozen ground, their hands bleeding from the effort. They set up defensive positions around the town's perimeter. They rationed their ammunition, counting every bullet, every grenade, every mortar shell. The German attacks began on December 20th. Panzer tanks rolled toward the American positions, their massive guns capable of destroying anything in their path. Infantry followed in overwhelming numbers. The Wehrmacht was throwing everything they had at Bastogne. James crouched in his foxhole, watching the tanks approach through the snow. His M1 Garand rifle felt pathetically small against those steel monsters. But the 101st had learned something in Normandy, something the Germans were about to discover the hard way. Paratroopers don't have tanks. They don't have heavy artillery. All they have is courage, creativity, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. "Wait for it," Sergeant Davis whispered from the next foxhole. "Let them get close." The lead tank was 50 yards away. 40. 30. "Now!" Davis screamed. James and 3 other men burst from their positions, sprinting toward the tank through a hail of machine gun fire. Private Thompson from Texas threw himself under the tank's treads with a satchel charge. The explosion lifted the 30-ton machine off the ground. 2 more men attacked the second tank with sticky bombs, makeshift explosives that clung to the armor. The German infantry, expecting an easy victory against trapped Americans, suddenly found themselves fighting men who attacked like cornered wolves. Fierce, desperate, deadly. By nightfall, the Germans had retreated, leaving behind burning tanks and dozens of casualties. They had been shocked by the Americans' ferocity. But this was just the beginning. The real test was coming. If you're enjoying this story of incredible courage, do me a favor and hit that like button. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments. Are you watching from Texas? London? Maybe somewhere else entirely? I love hearing from viewers all around the globe. Now, let's see what happened when the Germans made their biggest mistake. December 21st, 1944. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero. James Miller hadn't felt his toes in hours. He shared a foxhole with Bobby Chin, both of them huddled together for warmth, their breath-forming ice crystals on their collars. Around them, the forest was silent except for the occasional crack of artillery in the distance. They had been given orders to hold a crossroads 2 miles outside Bastogne. Just 12 men. 12 frozen, exhausted paratroopers against whatever the German army decided to throw at them. "I can't stop shaking," Bobby said, his teeth chattering. Not from fear. Just cold. James nodded. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. They'd wrapped their feet in newspaper and rags, trying to prevent frostbite. Some guys had already lost toes to the cold. Others had pneumonia. But nobody asked to leave their positions. The word had spread through the ranks. They were all that stood between the Germans and a breakthrough. If they fell back, Bastogne fell. If Bastogne fell, the war might be lost. Sergeant Davis crawled over to their position. His face was gray, his lips blue. Movement in the tree line. About 200 yards out. Looks like a company, maybe more. They're setting up for an assault. James peered over the edge of his foxhole. Through the falling snow, He could see German soldiers moving between the trees. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. And behind them, the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger tank, the most feared weapon in the German arsenal. "We can't stop a Tiger with rifles," Bobby whispered. Davis grinned, and James noticed the sergeant had lost a front tooth somewhere in the last few days. "No, we can't. But we've got something better. We've got spite and stubbornness." He pulled out a bazooka from beneath his coat. "And we've got this. One rocket. One shot. Anybody here a gambling man?" The Germans attacked at dawn. The Tiger tank led the advance, its massive guns swiveling toward the American positions. Infantry spread out behind it, at least 100 men moving through the snow. They were confident. They had overwhelming force. They had armor. They had everything. Everything except an understanding of who they were fighting. The tank fired. The shell screamed over James's head, exploding in the trees behind him. Dirt and snow rained down. His ears rang. But he stayed in his foxhole, waiting. "Hold your fire," Davis yelled. "Wait for my signal." The Germans were 50 yards away. 40. Close enough that James could see their faces beneath their helmets. Young faces. Scared faces. Not so different from his own. Now, Davis stood up, exposed himself completely, and fired the bazooka. The rocket streaked through the air, trailing smoke. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then the rocket struck the Tiger tank's treads. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough. The tank lurched to a stop, immobilized. "Light 'em up," Davis screamed. 12 American rifles opened fire. The German infantry, expecting an easy advance behind their tank, suddenly found themselves pinned down by accurate, disciplined fire. James squeezed his trigger methodically. Once, twice, 3 times. Each shot counted. Each bullet was precious. The Germans returned fire, but their assault had stalled. Without the tank leading them, without the psychological advantage of overwhelming force, they hesitated. And hesitation on a battlefield is death. For 6 hours, 12 American paratroopers held that crossroads against an entire German company. They used every trick they'd learned. They shifted positions constantly, making the Germans think there were more of them. They shouted fake orders, pretending to coordinate with non-existent reinforcements. When they ran low on ammunition, they scavenged from German casualties who had fallen close to their lines. Bobby took a bullet in the shoulder around noon. James bandaged him with trembling, frozen fingers. "You okay?" "Been better," Bobby gasped. "Been worse too. Remember that time in Normandy when I got hit by shrapnel?" "That was last week." "Exactly. This is fine. This is totally fine." Bobby picked up his rifle with his good hand and kept firing. By late afternoon, the Germans withdrew. They left behind their immobilized tank, dozens of casualties, and something more valuable than any weapon. They left behind their confidence. The word spread through the German ranks like wildfire. The Americans in Bastogne wouldn't break. Couldn't break. Were impossible to break. That night, as James and Bobby huddled in their foxhole, sharing a can of cold beans that tasted like heaven, they heard something that made their blood run cold. The rumble of engines. Lots of engines. The Germans were bringing in reinforcements. Massive reinforcements. The real battle for Bastogne was about to begin, and the 101st Airborne, freezing, starving, and surrounded, were about to face a demand that would define them forever. December 22nd, 1944. The morning fog was so thick that James could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He had been awake all night, too cold to sleep, listening to the sound of German tanks and trucks moving into position around Bastogne. The noose was tightening. At 11:30 a.m., something unusual happened. The shooting stopped. Complete silence fell over the battlefield, eerie and unnatural after days of constant gunfire. James looked at Bobby, whose shoulder was bandaged and his face pale from blood loss. "What's going on?" Bobby whispered. Sergeant Davis came running down the line, his expression urgent. "We got Germans approaching under a white flag. They want to parley." 4 German officers had walked right up to the American lines, carrying a white flag of truce. They were led to Colonel Harper, who commanded one of the regiments defending Bastogne. The German officers were professional, polite, and absolutely certain of their position. The senior German officer handed over a typed message. It was an ultimatum demanding immediate surrender. The message was clear. The Americans were completely surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and facing annihilation. The German commander was offering them one chance to surrender with honor, to save their lives and avoid pointless bloodshed. The message made its way up to General McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne in Bastogne. Officers gathered around as he read it. The room was silent. Everyone knew the situation. They were surrounded by German forces that outnumbered them 5-1. They had limited ammunition, limited food, limited medical supplies. Winter was killing men as surely as bullets. Relief forces were still days away, fighting through German lines to reach them. Any reasonable military commander would at least consider the offer. Any logical assessment of the situation suggested that surrender might be the only option to prevent total annihilation. General McAuliffe read the ultimatum twice. Then he looked up at his officers and said one word. Just one word that would echo through history and become the defining moment of the Battle of Bastogne. Nuts. The room erupted in laughter. Exhausted, frozen, desperate men laughed until tears ran down their faces. Because that single word captured everything they felt. The defiance. The refusal to quit. The absolute certainty that they would rather die fighting than surrender to the Germans who had started this war, who had bombed London, who had murdered millions. Colonel Harper had to deliver the response to the waiting German officers. He walked out to where they stood, still holding their white flag, still confident that the Americans would see reason. "What is your commander's response?" the German officer asked in perfect English. Harper looked him straight in the eye. "The American commander's response is nuts." The German officer looked confused. "What does this mean?" "Nuts." Harper smiled, a cold, hard smile. "It means go to hell. And I'll tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every last one of you." The German officers returned to their lines, stunned and angry. They had expected surrender. They had expected broken men grateful for a chance to save their lives. Instead, they had been told, in the most American way possible, that the 101st Airborne would never quit. Word of McAuliffe's response spread through the American lines like electricity. Men who had been on the verge of collapse suddenly found new strength. James heard about it in his foxhole and actually laughed out loud for the first time in days. "Did you hear what the general said?" he asked Bobby. "Yeah. Nuts. That's perfect. That's absolutely perfect." But the laughter didn't last long, because now the Germans were furious. They had offered mercy and been mocked. They had offered an honorable surrender and been insulted. The assault that followed would be the most vicious yet. At 6 p.m., the German artillery opened up. Shells rained down on Bastogne like a steel hurricane. The bombardment lasted for 2 hours, the most intense shelling James had ever experienced. The ground shook. Buildings collapsed. Men screamed. The world became nothing but explosions and fire and flying debris. When the shelling stopped, James's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear. His foxhole had partially collapsed. Bobby was unconscious, blood running from his nose. James dragged his friend to better cover, his own hands trembling. Then he heard it. The sound every soldier dreaded. Tank engines. Dozens of them. And behind the tanks, the tramp of thousands of feet. The Germans were launching a massive assault on the southern perimeter of Bastogne. Everything they had. Every tank, every soldier, every weapon. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne fixed their bayonets. They checked their ammunition and found they had maybe 20 rounds each. Some had less. They looked at each other across their frozen foxholes and saw their own fear reflected back. But they also saw something else. Determination. Pride. The knowledge that they were screaming eagles, and screaming eagles don't surrender. What would you do in this situation? Surrounded, freezing, outnumbered, with barely any ammunition left? Would you have the courage to say nuts to the enemy and keep fighting? Think about it and drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what you would have done. And if this story is giving you chills, smash that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear about real courage. Now, let's see what happened when the full weight of the German army crashed against these impossible men. The German assault came in waves, like an unstoppable tide of steel and fury. James crouched in his foxhole, his M1 Garand clutched in frozen hands, watching the shadows of panzer tanks emerge through the falling snow. Behind them, hundreds of German infantry advanced in perfect formation, their white winter camouflage making them nearly invisible against the landscape. "Here they come!" someone shouted down the line. James's first shot dropped a German soldier at 70 yards. His second jammed. The rifle's mechanism had frozen solid. Around him, other paratroopers were having the same problem. They'd been outside in sub-zero temperatures for so long that their weapons were failing. "Fix bayonets!" Sergeant Davis screamed. Bobby, conscious again but barely able to stand, looked at James with wide eyes. "We're going to have to fight them hand to hand, aren't we?" "Looks that way." The tanks rolled closer, their machine guns chattering, tearing up the frozen earth around the American positions. James watched a panzer crush an abandoned foxhole, grinding it into the dirt. These weren't the light tanks they'd faced before. These were the big ones. The killers. Then something miraculous happened. The fog that had blanketed Bastogne for days suddenly lifted. And through the break in the clouds came the most beautiful sound James had ever heard. The roar of aircraft engines. "Air support!" Someone yelled. "We've got air support!" American P-47 Thunderbolt fighters screamed out of the sky, their wings loaded with bombs and rockets. They dove on the German tanks like hawks on mice. Explosions bloomed across the battlefield. A panzer erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions. Another tank ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine. But the German infantry kept coming. They were committed now, too close to the American lines to turn back. 75 yards. 50. 40. James got his rifle working again, cleared the jam, and started firing. Around him, the 101st Airborne poured everything they had into the advancing Germans. Machine guns chattered. Grenades arced through the air. Men screamed orders and curses and prayers all mixed together. Private Thompson from Texas, the same kid who'd blown up a tank days earlier, suddenly stood up in his foxhole. He was out of ammunition, but he'd found a German machine gun from a previous battle. He mounted it on the lip of his position and opened fire, sweeping the weapon back and forth, his face twisted in a snarl of determination. "Come on!" he screamed at the Germans. "Come on! We're right here. We're the 101st Airborne. We don't know how to retreat." The German advance stalled. Not because they were outgunned, they weren't. Not because they were outnumbered, they had far more men. The advance stalled because the Germans, for the first time, truly understood what they were facing. These Americans weren't normal soldiers. They were something different. Something that didn't break, didn't quit, didn't know how to give up. A young German lieutenant, no older than 20, stumbled into James's foxhole. They both raised their weapons, finger on triggers, but James was faster. He could have shot the kid. Should have shot him. But there was something in the German's eyes. Not hatred. Not rage. Just exhaustion. Fear. The same things James felt. "Surrender," James said in broken German, a word he'd learned from prisoners. The lieutenant dropped his weapon and raised his hands. "You are the Screaming Eagles?" he asked in heavily accented English. "Yeah. We were told you would be easy. We were told you would surrender." The young German looked around at the frozen, exhausted, but unbroken Americans. "Our commanders lied to us." By nightfall on December 22nd, the German assault had been repulsed again. Not defeated, not destroyed, but pushed back. The Wehrmacht had thrown everything at Bastogne and the 101st Airborne had held. Barely. By the thinnest of margins. But they had held. James sat in his foxhole that night, Bobby leaning against him for warmth. They shared a cigarette, passing it back and forth, neither of them speaking. What was there to say? They had survived another day. Tomorrow they would probably have to do it all over again. Across the lines, German soldiers sat in their own positions, cold and miserable and increasingly afraid. The word had spread through their ranks. The Americans in Bastogne were impossible to defeat. They should have surrendered days ago. Any rational force would have. But these paratroopers with the eagle patches weren't rational. They were fanatics. Devils. Monsters who laughed at death and refused to acknowledge when they were beaten. December 23rd and 24th brought more attacks, each one bloodier than the last. The Germans were getting desperate. They knew American reinforcements were fighting their way toward Bastogne. If they didn't break through soon, their entire offensive would collapse. On Christmas Eve, James was sharing a can of beans with Bobby when they heard the sound of engines approaching from the south. Different engines. American engines. Is that? Bobby started. Sergeant Davis came running down the line, actually smiling. Patton's tanks. Patton broke through. We're not surrounded anymore. The relief that swept through the 101st Airborne wasn't just about survival. It was validation. They had held. Against impossible odds, with no food, no proper winter clothing, limited ammunition, and surrounded by enemies, they had held the line. They had said nuts to the German army and made it stick. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The Germans had one more desperate assault planned, and this one would be the most vicious of all. December 26, 1944. Patton's tanks had broken the siege of Bastogne, but the Germans weren't finished. They couldn't afford to be. Their entire winter offensive depended on taking this town, and they launched one final desperate assault with everything they had left. James Miller stood in his foxhole, now reinforced with sandbags and ammunition that had arrived with the relief column. For the first time in a week, he had a full belly and warm socks. His rifle was clean and working. Bobby Chen, his shoulder properly bandaged by real medics, stood beside him. Feels weird, doesn't it? Bobby said. Having enough bullets. Knowing we've got tanks backing us up. James nodded. Yeah. But you know what? I think we could have held even without them. You really believe that? James looked down the line at the other paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. Men who had frozen, starved, and bled for this town. Men who had been told they were surrounded and responded by attacking. Men who had turned nuts into a battle cry that would echo through history. Yeah, James said. I really do. The German assault came at dawn, and it was massive. Tiger tanks, Panthers, infantry divisions, everything the Wehrmacht could scrape together for one final push. The artillery barrage was so intense that the ground itself seemed to shake. But this time, the Americans had artillery of their own. They had air support. They had reinforcements. And they had the 101st Airborne, who had already proven they could hold this ground with nothing. Now, with proper support, they were unstoppable. James fired his rifle in steady, controlled bursts. Around him, the other paratroopers did the same. No panic. No chaos. Just disciplined, professional soldiers doing what they did best. Patton's tanks rolled forward, engaging the German armor at close range. American artillery pounded German positions. The P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead, bombing and strafing. But it was the paratroopers who broke the German assault. Not the tanks. Not the artillery. The infantry. The men who had already proven they couldn't be defeated. A German major, captured during the fighting, was brought to the American lines. He looked at the eagle patches on the paratroopers' shoulders and shook his head in disbelief. You are not normal soldiers, he said to Sergeant Davis. Normal soldiers surrender when they are beaten. You were beaten. The situation was hopeless. But you refused to accept it. Davis grinned. That's right. We're the 101st Airborne. We're the Screaming Eagles. And we don't know the meaning of the word surrender. By January 3, 1945, the Battle of Bastogne was over. The German winter offensive had failed. Hitler's last gamble to turn the tide of the war had been stopped by a group of American paratroopers who simply refused to quit. The 101st Airborne suffered terrible casualties. Nearly 2,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. They had endured conditions that would have broken lesser units. But they had held. And in holding, they had changed the course of the war. James Miller returned home after the war ended. He rarely talked about Bastogne. How could he explain it to people who hadn't been there? How could he describe what it felt like to be surrounded, freezing, starving, and still find the courage to tell the enemy to go to hell? But sometimes, on cold winter nights, he would remember. He'd remember Bobby Chen, who survived his wounds and became a doctor in San Francisco. He'd remember Sergeant Davis, who opened a hardware store in Chicago and sent Christmas cards to his old squad every year. He'd remember Private Thompson from Texas, who didn't make it home but whose courage in that final battle earned him a medal his family treasured forever. Most of all, James remembered that moment when General McAuliffe said, "Nuts," and an entire division of paratroopers laughed in the face of death. Because that's what the 101st Airborne did. They jumped into France when everyone said it was impossible. They held Bastogne when everyone said it was hopeless. They looked at situations that would make normal men surrender, and they said one word: nuts. The legacy of the Screaming Eagles at Bastogne lives on today. It's taught in military academies around the world as an example of how courage, determination, and refusal to accept defeat can overcome impossible odds. The German soldiers who fought there never forgot the paratroopers who wouldn't break. For the rest of their lives, when they heard the words 101st Airborne, they remembered the frozen hell of Bastogne and the American soldiers who proved that sometimes the side with the most tanks and the most guns doesn't win. Sometimes the side with the most heart does. If this story of incredible courage moved you, hit that subscribe button and share this video with friends who need to hear it. Have you ever faced a situation where everyone said you should quit, but you kept going anyway? Drop your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear about times when you channeled your inner screaming eagle and refused to give up. These stories of courage aren't just history. They're lessons for all of us about what humans can accomplish when we refuse to accept defeat. Thank you for watching, and remember, when life surrounds you and tells you to surrender, sometimes the best response is just one word: nuts.